Hello everyone, I am the Desert Gardener, and today I have some tomato planting tips for you. So I've got my tea, let's talk about that. So I've got a bunch of different tomato planting tips I'd like to talk about, but there's one in particular I'd really like to focus on. I am going to attempt to change your mind on a very well-established, common tomato planting technique, and that is, should you plant your tomatoes deep? So before we talk about that, I want to make sure that all the newer gardeners out there know exactly what we're talking about. So I'm going to go over what that is really quickly. So the idea behind it is you measure your plant, including the roots, then you do a little math and you figure out what 1/3 of that would be, which would be right about here. Then you take your pruners and you snip off any lower branches, because you can't bury those branches, they'll cause rot. And then you have to snip off a few above that as well, because you don't want any branches resting on the soil that could introduce soil-borne diseases. Then you plant it right about here, nice and deep. And the idea is all these little hairs along the stem are going to turn into roots. And the more roots the plant has, the bigger, stronger, healthier, and more tomatoes it's going to produce, right? Well, unfortunately, it doesn't seem to work that way. So let me start out by telling you about a little experiment somebody I know did. And just to be really upfront, this wasn't a very large sample size, and it wasn't done by a big university. It was just a very experienced gardener that had something he wanted to test. So what he did is he took a container about like this one here, and he planted a tomato seed in it, put it in his greenhouse, and then at springtime he planted it in his garden right at soil level. So in other words, he didn't plant it deep. Then at the same time he took another seed and he put it in one of these 72 tray cells. Then he up-potted it into one of these nursery pots. Then he up-potted it again into a container like this, and then at springtime he planted it in the garden at the same time he planted the other one. Now I should note that every time he up-potted, he planted the plant just a little bit deeper than it was before. So by the time it got into the garden, he planted it nice and deep, 1/3 deep, just like we spoke about before. So he then just kept an eye on the plants. Now the first plant, the one he didn't plant deep, was larger, it began producing sooner, it began ripening tomatoes sooner, and ultimately produced more tomatoes. So why is that? Now, if planting deep is so good for the plant, how come it didn't outperform the plant that wasn't planted deep? Well, there's actually a few reasons for that. And let's go over the really obvious one first. I'm assuming some of you probably already caught this. And that is, every time you transplant a tomato, or any plant for that matter, it causes stress to the plant. And transplant shock is something gardeners have known about for many years. What happens is when you stress the plant, it will slow its growth. Oftentimes it'll stop growing from anywhere from 2 days to 2 weeks. And so every time he up-potted, he was simply slowing the growth of that plant. So by the time he got it into the ground with the other one, it was already behind the curve. So it made sense that the other one did better. But before we go on to the other reasons, let's take a little detour here and talk about that. More and more, I am seeing gardeners that are switching from those 72 trays into planting into larger containers like these. And the way that works is you fill it up about 3/4 of the way with a regular potting soil, and then the last 1 inch you use seed starting mix. Then you plant your seed in there, And then the seed has that nice, fluffy, light seed starting mix to start out in, so it can easily pop out of the top of the soil. But once it starts producing roots and it gets down into the regular potting soil, it will start getting nutrients from that right away. Then you can simply plant from here directly into your garden. So you're only potting once. It's a lot less stress on the plant. Now, the only downside to doing this is it takes up way more space. Instead of a 72 tray cell, you only get 18 when you use a larger container like this. Now, of course, you can, if you have a big greenhouse or something, then it's probably not going to make a difference. Or if you have a lot of room, you can get extra grow lights, but it will require triple the number of grow lights. So what if you're somebody who doesn't have room for to triple their grow lights, or they just can't afford to buy all this extra equipment? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do first. First off, whenever I see somebody online and they're transplanting tomato plants, I'm always very surprised at how rough they are with the plant. They'll pull it out of the pot, plop it down on the ground, and they're messing around with the hole in their tools and other stuff until they finally get around to putting it in. And this causes a lot of extra stress to the plant. So I'm going to tell you what I do. I go out to the garden and I dig myself the appropriate sized hole, and then I have everything I need right within arm's length. So I have a little bucket here that's full of fill dirt and compost, and then I have my stake, and I have a little plant clip. Basically everything I need is going to be right there. So then I walk over to a different part of the garden where I've got my plants ready to go, and they're sitting in the shade, and of course they've already been hardened off and it's late in the day, all the usual planting stuff. Then I go over and I slip it out of the pot as easily as I can. Then I immediately put it in the hole, fill it up with dirt, put in my stake or my trellis or whatever I'm using, put my mulch over the top, and then immediately water with a water-soluble fertilizer. And by doing it quickly and easily like that, we are eliminating as much stress as we can. That way the plant isn't delaying its growth because of stress. So let's get back to our planting deep example. So remember, one of the first things that needed to be done is I needed to trim off a bunch of those lower branches and then even some of the higher ones before planting. That's going to cause stress too, and that is going to slow the growth of the plant. So it's not really a good idea to do. So let's get to the root of the matter here, literally. So let's say we have two tomato plants that are in the ground. One is planted deep and one isn't. At the end of the season, we're going to dig them up and we're going to look at those roots. Now the one that wasn't planted deep is going to have a slightly larger root ball and a much longer root ball. Oftentimes the roots will grow 4, 5, 6 feet deep into the ground. Now, the one that you did plant deep, the root ball looks quite a bit differently. It's a little smaller, the roots are a lot shorter, it doesn't go as deep as the one that you planted shallow. It does, however, have a bunch of roots that are coming off the stem here. So you might say, well, don't those extra roots help and make the plant produce better? Well, no, not really, for a couple of reasons. First off, when we plant at ground level, the first thing the plant does is begin to grow those roots downward. And the next thing it does is starts producing flowers and fruit. So it basically has those two jobs. But when you plant a plant deep, it does those two things, but it also has to do two other things. And the first one is it has to regrow those stems that you cut off. And the second thing is it has to start growing the roots along the stem. So you might think, well, maybe that counteracts everything and those roots are so good. Well, no, because those roots never get more than a couple inches, and they're right at the top of the soil, the part of the soil that is the driest and the hottest. So those roots up at the top really aren't doing much. It's the roots at the bottom that are really helping the plant. That's where it's getting all the water, that's where it's getting all the nutrients. There isn't a lot of nutrients right at the top 1 inch of the soil because it dries out so quickly. All the microbiology is down a little deeper within the first couple of feet usually. So the extra roots that you're gaining at the top really aren't helping at all. In fact, nothing about planting the plant deep is helpful. In fact, it's actually the opposite. You're simply slowing the growth of the plant by every step of the way, by cutting off those branches, by making it grow roots at the top that it's not going to use. There is simply no benefit to doing it. So I am going to stop doing it for the most part. Now, I am going to do a larger experiment here this year. I have already planted a few tomato plants nice and deep, and I'm going to plant some right at ground level. And I'm going to keep an eye on them, and I'm going to keep you guys informed of how they're doing. So if you want to know for sure how things are doing, subscribe and hit that little bell and I'll keep you up to date. But close as I can tell, planting deep is not helpful. There is no benefit to it. So, hope you got something out of this, and I'll see you in the next one.